Feudal Japan was one of the most fascinating and prolonged periods in Japanese history. From the 12th century until the mid-19th century, political power was in the hands of the shoguns, military lords who ruled in the emperor's name but held absolute authority over the nation. In this era of wars, alliances, and codes of honor, a figure emerged that would embody the spirit of ancient Japan, the samurai. These warriors were not merely soldiers. They were living symbols of discipline, loyalty, and sacrifice, guided by the bushidō code, a philosophy that combined military duty with moral and spiritual values. The history of the samurai is also the history of Japan's unification and modernization. From the civil wars of the Sengoku period to the peace imposed by the Tokugawa shogunate, samurai evolved from nomadic warriors into refined bureaucrats, bearers of a culture that blended poetry with the sword. For centuries, they defended their lords and their land, but they also became guardians of a tradition that would deeply influence Japanese art, politics, and identity. With the arrival of the Meiji Restoration in the 19th century and Japan's opening to the Western world, their era came to an end, but their legacy endures to this day in the spirit of modern Japan, in its sense of duty, respect for honor, and passion for perfection. The birth of a civilization based on honor and tradition. Amid the mist rising over the rice fields and pine-covered mountains, one of the most unique civilizations in human history emerged. Japan, isolated by the sea and shaped by volcanoes, tempered its character in the struggle against the elements and in the constant pursuit of balance between order and spirit. Its history is that of a nation that, for more than a millennium, looked inward to define what the word honor meant. The Japanese archipelago, composed of thousands of islands, of which the main ones are Honshu, Kyushu, Shikoku, and Hokkaido, has been since ancient times a territory separated from the Asian continent. This geographical distance translated into a deeply introspective culture, but at the same time permeable to external influences when they arrived via the maritime routes from Korea and China. From these first contacts, Japan adopted writing, Buddhism, state organization, and temple architecture, but did so with exceptional skill in turning the foreign into its own. In the centuries before the imperial era, political power was dispersed among regional clans. These clans, known as uji, grouped around divine lineages and worshipped the kami, spirits of nature that represented the very life of the archipelago. Among them, the Yamato clan managed to consolidate hegemony in central Honshu and laid the foundations of the Japanese monarchy. From their lineage would emerge the first emperors, considered direct descendants of the sun goddess Amaterasu. Shintoism, born from this connection with the divine, became the spiritual thread that united the Japanese with the land, the sky, and their ancestors. During the first centuries of state organization, the imperial court sought to reflect the splendor of China. In the 7th century, under the influence of the Tang dynasty, political reforms known as taika were implemented, which centralized administration, established censuses, and organized the territory into provinces. The goal was clear: to transform warrior clans into officials of the emperor. However, that illusion of control from the capital would soon fade. Power in Japan would always find its balance elsewhere, not in the palaces but in arms. The capital was moved several times, from Nara to Heijō-kyo and later to Heian-kyo, the future Kyoto, each move marking a shift in the balance between imperial authority and aristocratic families. In the gardens of Heian, a refined culture flourished where poetry, painting, and the subtleties of etiquette defined prestige. However, beneath that elegant surface, the shadows of a new class were beginning to form: the samurai. Loyal warriors, first to the clan, then to the lord, who would soon become the true face of Japan. The birth of the samurai caste was more a consequence than a plan. The great aristocratic families, unable to control their domains from the capital, began to entrust the security of their lands to armed men, experts in bow and sword. These rural warriors from minor lineages forged their own code, distinct from that of the court. Where nobles sought the harmony of words, they found virtue in action. Their loyalty, discipline, and willingness to die for honor marked the beginning of a profound transformation. Over the centuries, the duality became evident. Japan lived between two worlds, that of spirit and that of steel. While the court maintained rituals and poetry, the provinces became the scene of private wars. In that contrast, the national identity was forged, Beauty and violence coexisted without contradiction. Art and sword nourished each other. The landscape also shaped their character. Surrounded by stormy seas, battered by earthquakes and eruptions, the Japanese learned to live in constant balance with the unpredictable. Nature was not an enemy, but a force to be understood. From that relationship arose a unique aesthetic sensibility where impermanence, known as mujo, and simplicity, wabi-sabi, became philosophical foundations. The samurai sword was not just a weapon, it was an extension of the soul. By the 8th century, Japan had already reached a level of cultural and political development comparable to its continental neighbors, but with a distinctive mark, a voluntary isolation that allowed it to preserve its own while absorbing what was foreign without losing identity. That balance between openness and defense would mark all its history. From the courts of Heian to the wars of the Sengoku period, from Zen temples to the fields of Sekigahara, Japan would be the stage of a constant struggle between order and chaos, between duty and ambition. Its destiny would be defined on the battlefields, but also in the silent gardens where monks meditated on the fleetingness of existence. Origins and fall of the Heian period. In the year 794, Emperor Kanmu ordered the relocation of the imperial capital to a new site which he named Heian-kyo, meaning the capital of peace and tranquility, located where present-day Kyoto stands. With this act, a period of nearly 4 centuries began, remembered as the golden age of the Japanese aristocracy, an era in which cultural refinement, poetry, and spirituality coexisted with corruption, intrigue, and ultimately the birth of a new military order. The Heian court became the center of political and aesthetic power of Imperial Japan. The wooden palaces, surrounded by gardens and ponds, reflected the harmony that the elite believed they had achieved. There, nobles competed for the emperor's favor not with the sword but through the art of words, calligraphy, and poetic wit. Men and women of the court composed verses in which a fallen flower or a veiled moon symbolized the human soul. From these sensibilities arose one of the most emblematic works of world literature, the tale of Genji, written by Murasaki Shikibu, a court lady who detailed the elegance and moral emptiness of her time. However, behind the appearance of serenity, the structure of power began to deteriorate. The China-inspired administrative system implemented during the Taika reforms had lost effectiveness. Imperial lands were fragmented among powerful clans who obtained tax concessions and exemptions. Buddhist temples and aristocrats amassed vast estates known as shōgun, which escaped state control. The emperor, theoretically divine, became increasingly symbolic. In this vacuum of authority emerged the figure of the regent. No clan embodied this role with as much power as the Fujiwara, a family that, through skillful marital alliances, managed to place their daughters as wives of emperors and thus exercise power behind the throne. During the 9th and 10th centuries, the Fujiwara clan controlled imperial decisions, state finances, and appointments to administrative positions. Their hegemony transformed the government into a ceremonial monarchy and the court into a stage of internal rivalries. Meanwhile, far from Heian, the real country was transforming. In the rural provinces, the great landowners, mostly impoverished former nobles or retired officials, began to rely on armed bands to protect their lands from raiders and the fiscal excesses of the capital. These armed groups, made up of men hardened by country life, were the forerunners of the samurai. At first, they were simple guardians. Over time, they would become a separate class. Imperial Japan, enclosed in its courtly delicacy, ignored the change. Ceremonies and poems continued their course, while peasants bowed before armed lords who no longer obeyed the capital. The beauty of the Heian world was, at its core, the beauty of a twilight, intense, refined, but fleeting. By the mid-11th century, conflicts between military clans began to disturb the political balance. Two warrior lineages rose as the most powerful, the Taira, established in the west, and the Minamoto, with influence in the east. Both descended from minor branches of the imperial family, which legitimized their ambition. Their rise represented an irreversible change. For the first time, political power leaned toward the provinces and those who wielded weapons. The 12th century witnessed a latent confrontation between the courtly aristocracy and the new military elite. In 1156, the Hogan conflict revealed the fracture between the supporters of different retired emperors, backed by the Taira and Minamoto clans. Although brief, the rebellion marked a before and after. Wars were no longer decided in the halls of Heian, but on the battlefields. The samurai proved to be more loyal to their leaders than to the throne. 3 years later, the Heiji conflict between 1159 and 1160 consolidated the Taira clan's dominance over the capital. Its leader, Taira no Kiyomori, emerged as the most powerful figure in the country. He became government minister and married his daughter to the emperor, imitating the political model of the Fujiwara. But his rise broke a millennial order. For the first time, a warrior dominated the imperial court. The power of the Taira brought momentary stability, but also resentment. Kiyomori moved the center of power to the western coast, strengthening the ports and opening trade routes with China. This contact, however, generated tensions with the Minamoto, who saw their influence threatened. In the shadows of the capital, the former rivals awaited their chance to strike back. The balance was broken in 1180 when the Genpei War erupted, the conflict that would seal the fate of the Heian period. For 5 years, Japan became a continuous battlefield. The plains, temples, and villages burned under the red banners of the Taira and the white of the Minamoto. It was a war of clans, but also a struggle between two visions of the country, that of courtly refinement against that of military order. The chroniclers of the time described that war as the end of a world. In the mountains, warrior monks defended their temples. At sea, improvised fleets fought under showers of flaming arrows. Later legends would tell that even the kami watched the conflict with sadness. Poetry fell silent, gardens withered, and the sword became the new language of power. In 1185, at the naval battle of Danura, the Minamoto crushed the Taira in an epic clash in the Shimonoseki Strait. The young imperial heir Antoku, grandson of Kiyomori, drowned along with his grandmother, who carried him in her arms into the waters, refusing to be captured. With his death, the last hope of restoring the courtly splendor of Heian was extinguished. The old order had fallen. In its place, a new power structure emerged, led by Minamoto no Yoritomo, who would establish the first military government in Japanese history, the Bakufu or Kamakura shogunate. From then on, the sword would rule where the brush once did. The Genpei War and the establishment of the Kamakura shogunate. The echo of the drums resonated in the mountains, and the banners waved in the wind like tongues of fire. It was the year 1180, and Japan was divided between two forces that not only represented rival clans but also two irreconcilable visions of the country's destiny. On one side, the Taira, guardians of courtly order and heirs to the refinement of Heian. On the other, the Minamoto, warriors hardened by exile and war, ready to establish a new era of iron and discipline. The conflict, known as the Genpei War, was the first major nationwide confrontation that faced the most powerful houses of medieval Japan. What began as a series of regional uprisings quickly transformed into a full-scale civil war. Battles spread from the plains of Kyoto to the western sea straits, devastating temples, villages, and crops. It was a war of clans, but also a war of principles, the twilight of the world of poetry and the rise of the world of the sword. The trigger was the arrogance of the Taira clan, which under the leadership of Taira no Kiyomori had achieved unprecedented power. Kiyomori had managed to place his grandson, the child emperor Antoku, on the throne, displacing the other imperial branches. But his policy of favoritism and iron control over the court caused widespread discontent among the nobility, warrior monks, and former allies. It was then that Minamoto no Yoritomo, son of the late Minamoto no Yoshitomo, executed years earlier by order of the Taira, reappeared from his exile in the Izu region. In a gesture that would change the course of history, he raised his clan's banner and called the warriors of the East to rebellion. His cause was not personal revenge, but the restoration of his lineage's honor and the end of courtly domination over the samurai. The first battles were indecisive. At Ishibashiyama, Yoritomo was defeated, but he managed to escape thanks to the loyalty of his followers. Taking refuge in Kamakura, a territory surrounded by mountains and sea, he began to reorganize his forces. From there, he established the foundations of an autonomous military government, separate from the imperial court. That coastal city, until then insignificant, would become the heart of the new Japan. The Genpei War was fought with brutality previously unknown. The samurai fought hand-to-hand, announcing their names and lineages before engaging in duels, a custom that mixed pride with fatality. Chronicles, especially the poem Heike Monogatari, recounted the clashes as epics where bravery and tragedy walked together. The war forged not only heroes, but also martyrs. One of the most famous was Minamoto no Yoshitsune, half-brother of Yoritomo, whose military genius marked the decisive victories of the campaign. Yoshitsune, trained in the Hiei monasteries and educated in art and tactics, combined the ferocity of the warrior with the cunning of the strategist. At Ichinotani, he managed to surprise the Taira forces by descending with his army from an impossible cliff, attacking from where the enemy believed itself protected. That bold maneuver became a symbol of Japanese inventiveness. The pursuit continued westward. The Taira, defeated on land, took refuge in the sea, relying on their naval dominance. But fate caught up with them at Danura in the Shimonoseki Strait. On April 25, 1185, the two fleets faced each other in a battle that would define the country's future. The waters boiled under burning arrows and the hulls of the vessels. The Taira, outnumbered and betrayed by some allies, saw their line break. The tragedy culminated with the collective suicide of the defeated. The grandmother of the young Emperor Antoku, understanding the defeat, took the child in her arms and threw herself with him into the sea. Chronicles recount that their clothes floated briefly before disappearing beneath the waves. With their death, the Taira dynasty was extinguished, along with the last glow of the Heian world. Courtly Japan was symbolically drowning in the depths of the strait. The victory of the Minamoto marked an irreparable change. Instead of returning power to the emperor, Yoritomo consolidated his military authority. In 1192, after receiving the title of Sei Taishogun, that is, Great General who subdues the barbarians, he founded the Kamakura shogunate, the first military government in Japanese history. The political capital and the spiritual capital of the country were separated. Kyoto retained the emperor, but Kamakura ruled with the sword. The new system, known as bakufu, transformed the structure of the state. Yoritomo established a network of gokenin samurai vassals who swore personal loyalty to him and in return received land and local authority. This direct relationship between the shogun and his men created a balance different from the past. Power no longer descended from divine lineage, but from service and loyalty. The emperor, although still revered, became a symbolic figure while effective government rested with the shogun. Kamakura was not a city of palaces or poetry. It was a fortress among hills and beaches, a practical and austere refuge. There, the character that would define the following centuries was consolidated, the spirit of the disciplined warrior, order above luxury, and duty as the supreme virtue. Japan had changed its skin. However, the victory did not bring lasting peace. Tensions between Yoritomo and his brother Yoshitsune erupted shortly after the war. Jealous of the young general's prestige, the shogun declared him a traitor. Yoshitsune was pursued to his refuge in the north, where he ended his own life after being betrayed by a former ally. His death, shrouded in legend, made him one of the most revered tragic heroes of Japanese culture, the perfect warrior who fell not to the enemy, but to the envy of his own clan. Over time, Yoritomo consolidated his absolute power. He established administrative councils, military courts, and a system of provincial oversight. Japan officially entered its first feudal era. The balance between the emperor and the shogun, between the divine and the earthly, was sealed. The sword had imposed its authority, and the country began a long period governed by men of war. The bakufu system and the role of the samurai. With the creation of the Kamakura shogunate in 1192, Japan took an irreversible turn towards military government. The courtly splendor of Kyoto was replaced by the austerity of barracks and fortified temples. For the first time, the country was not governed by poets or nobles, but by warriors. The system that arose from this transformation would be known as bakufu, literally government of the general's tent, referring to the headquarters from which the shogun directed his men during campaigns. The Kamakura bakufu, established by Minamoto no Yoritomo, did not abolish imperial authority, but relegated it to a ceremonial role. The emperor remained the spiritual symbol of the country, descendant of the gods, but real power emanated from the shogun, the supreme commander of all armies. This political duality, composed of a sacred throne and a military government, would remain a constant in Japanese history for the next 7 centuries. From Kamakura, the shogun established an efficient and strictly disciplined hierarchical structure. At the top was himself, followed by the Madokoro, the executive council responsible for administration and finances, and the Monchujo, a court of justice tasked with resolving disputes among vassals. Below them, a network of shugo, i.e., military governors, and jito, local administrators, supervised each province. These men, appointed by the shogun, were responsible for maintaining order, collecting taxes, and ensuring loyalty in their territories. Unlike the Heian court bureaucracy, the Kamakura system was based on personal loyalty and obedience to the code of duty. There was no room for poetry or ambiguity. Honor was measured by action and fidelity. The samurai, the core of the new order, represented this ideal. They were warriors of minor lineage but of unbreakable spirit. Their bond with the shogun was not political but moral. In exchange for land, protection, or privileges, they swore to serve with absolute loyalty, even at the cost of their lives. In this new Japan, honor became a currency of value. A samurai had to live according to the principle of chugi, or unconditional loyalty, and maintain the meiyo, the idea of personal honor, as his most precious asset. Lying, deserting, or acting cowardly was worse than dying. Death, in fact, was considered a legitimate way to preserve dignity. This ideal, which centuries later would be known as bushidō, began to take shape in these years. The samurai was not just a soldier, but a man educated in self-control, discipline, and righteousness. He learned the art of war, but also poetry, writing, and brushwork. The sword used by these men, the legendary katana, was the soul of the warrior, but its value did not reside solely in its blade, but in what it represented: the purity of spirit and the connection between man and his duty. Carrying it was a sacred responsibility. A samurai's life was governed by a balance between violence and contemplation. He trained with the bow, spear, and short sword, or wakizashi, but also practiced Zen meditation to achieve serenity in the face of death. War was not an act of hatred, but a stage of virtue. Victory had to be clean and combat honorable. Even amidst the brutality of battles, gestures of respect toward the fallen enemy were expected. Martial training began in childhood. Young samurai were sent to schools or monasteries where they learned both how to fight and how to obey. Patience, modesty, and silence were essential virtues. An impulsive warrior was considered dangerous, a serene one, trustworthy. In the monasteries of Kamakura, it was taught that true strength resided in mastering one's own spirit before the sword. As the bakufu system consolidated, the country adopted a new notion of order. Provinces, previously dominated by rival clans, came under the supervision of the shogun's vassals. Justice was administered swiftly, and punishment for treason was exemplary. Control of territory no longer depended on blood, but on service. Samurai became the new administrators, tax collectors, and judges. The ideal of the warrior and that of the official merged into one. Kamakura became the moral heart of that new Japan. It was not a city of luxury, but an enclave of stone and discipline. Zen temples, such as Kenshoji and Engakuji, flourished under the patronage of the warriors, who found in Buddhism a way to reconcile violence with inner pursuit, the contemplation of emptiness, the sound of the wind in the bamboos, the stillness of the garden. All of this was part of the training of the samurai soul. However, this new order also contained its own fragility. The authority of the shogun depended on the loyalty of his vassals, and that loyalty, although solemn, could be broken with the death of the leader. After the death of Yoritomo in 1199, his lineage lost direct political control, giving way to the growing influence of the Hojo clan, which would establish a regency system under the name of the shogun. Even so, the bakufu system endured. Japan had found a model that combined the spirituality of the emperor with the strength of the samurai, a balance between the past and steel. It was a country ruled by men of war, but sustained by a code of honor that demanded more from them than from any king or noble in the world. The Hojo shogun period and the power of the regent, Jodo Dokoro, Hojo. When Minamoto no Yoritomo died in 1199, the Kamakura shogunate was left without its founding figure and without a successor of his caliber. The power vacuum gave rise to a new dynasty of shadow rulers, the Hojo, a family that, without holding the title of shogun, would dominate Japan for more than a century as regents or shiken. Under their control, military power transformed into a bureaucratic and familial system, rigid and efficient, capable of resisting even foreign threats. The rise of the Hojo began with Hojo Masako, Yoritomo's wife. After the shogun's death, Masako entered a convent but retained extraordinary political influence. Known as the nun shogun, she was the architect of her family's power. She manipulated alliances between clans and ensured that the regent position fell to her father, Hojo Tokimasa, who became the first shiken of the shogunate. From that moment, the Minamoto lineage was relegated to a ceremonial role, while the Hojo controlled the actual administration. The system they established was pragmatic. The shogun continued to exist, but his function was symbolic, a decorative figure often chosen from members of the imperial family or Kyoto aristocracy to maintain the appearance of legitimacy. The real power resided in the Jodo Dokoro, the government council dominated by the Hojo regents. From there, orders were issued, military governors appointed, and disputes among vassal clans resolved. The Hojo period marked the consolidation of the Bakufu as a lasting structure. The chain of command was strengthened, censuses were conducted, land ownership was regulated, and courts were established. Japan experienced an era of order, but also of control. The Hojo governed with a mix of paternal authority and constant surveillance. Rebellions were swiftly suppressed, and dissenting clans were eliminated without mercy. However, even the most disciplined system cannot escape the tension of power. The following decades were marked by internal intrigue and courtly rebellions. In 1221, the retired emperor Go-Toba attempted to restore imperial power in an uprising known as the Jokyu War. His attempt ended in disaster. Bakufu forces marched on Kyoto and crushed the revolt. Go-Toba was exiled, and the prestige of the imperial court was destroyed. From then on, the emperor would be a revered shadow, but without real influence. This victory consolidated the authority of the Hojo. Their power became almost absolute, supported by a network of alliances with the Gokenin and reinforced by efficient administration. For much of the 13th century, Japan experienced a period of relative stability. War had given way to vigilance and duty. But the tranquility of the archipelago would soon be shaken by a threat from across the sea. In the year 1274, the horizon of the archipelago was covered with foreign sails. From the Korean peninsula, a gigantic fleet was approaching the coasts of Kyushu. It was the army of the Mongol Empire, commanded by Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, who had conquered China and Korea and now demanded that Japan surrender and pay tribute. The letters sent by the Khan were ignored by the shogunate, which triggered an unprecedented invasion. The chroniclers of Kamakura described that day with reverent fear. The Mongols landed in Hakata Bay with tens of thousands of soldiers. Unlike the samurai who fought in individual duels, the Mongols fought in close formation with drums, mounted archers, and primitive firearms. Their arrows whistled through the air and their projectiles exploded with deafening noise, disconcerting the Japanese defenders. But the invasion was not completed. After intense fighting, a sudden storm struck the enemy fleet. Hundreds of ships were smashed against the coast. The survivors fled, leaving behind a landscape of destruction. The Japanese interpreted that phenomenon as divine intervention. They called it kamikaze, the wind of the gods, and believed that the kami had protected the nation from the invader. Kublai Khan did not surrender. In 1281, he launched a second, even larger invasion, with more than 140,000 men embarked on 2 fleets. For weeks, the Japanese fortified the coasts and resisted the attacks with iron discipline. When the enemy seemed about to break through the defenses, a new typhoon struck the region. The storm, more violent than the previous one, almost completely annihilated the Mongol fleet. The survivors were hunted down and executed. Once again, Japan had been saved by the divine wind. The Mongol invasions left a deep mark. Although the country had emerged victorious, the cost was enormous. The samurai who had fought did not receive new lands, since there were no conquests, and the shogunate's treasury was depleted by the defense. Discontent spread among the vassals, and the authority of the Hojo began to crumble. The spiritual prestige of Japan, however, rose. Zen monks interpreted the storms as a manifestation of the purity of the national soul. and the people reinforced their conviction that the island was protected by the gods. That belief, born from the Tempest, would become a foundational myth that would survive for centuries. Even so, the power of the Hojo fell into decline. Economic tensions, the growing autonomy of the daimyo, and internal struggles for the regency weakened the bakufu. The same structures that had given stability to the country turned into chains that prevented change. In the temples, monks recited sutras for peace. In the villages, peasants murmured about unbearable taxes. In the provincial courts, the younger samurai dreamed of independence. Japan had resisted the foreign enemy, but the real danger always lay within: the erosion of power, the ambition of clans, the eternal quest for balance between duty and freedom. The twilight of the Hojo was approaching, and with it, the end of the first great shogunate. Collapse of Kamakura and the brief imperial rule of Kenmu 1333 to 1336. At the beginning of the 14th century, the Kamakura shogunate had become a rigid structure, more concerned with preserving stability than with adapting to new times. The government of the Hojo, which for more than 100 years had ensured order, began to fracture under the weight of its own authority. What had once been a decentralized and efficient system of power was now an aging machine, controlled by regents who distrusted everything and everyone. The aftermath of the Mongol invasions had left a deep mark on the country. The samurai who had fought bravely in defense of the archipelago expected to be rewarded with lands or privileges, but the bakufu lacked resources. There was no loot to distribute, and the taxes meant to maintain coastal defense became unsustainable. Discontent spread among the clans, eroding the network of loyalties that had sustained Kamakura's power. Meanwhile, in Kyoto, a restless and ambitious emperor began to dream of restoring imperial authority. Go-Daigo, a direct descendant of the ancient monarchs, was not content to be a ceremonial figure. Educated in classical Chinese texts and convinced of his divine right, he aspired to return to the throne the power that the samurai had usurped centuries before. In a Japan divided between obedience and the desire for change, his cause resonated strongly among those who saw the Hojo as an exhausted regime. In 1331, Go-Daigo launched a rebellion against the shogunate. His initial attempt was crushed, and the emperor was captured and exiled to the remote island of Oki. But even in exile, his cause survived. Around him, discontented warriors and regional clans began to organize. Among them stood out two figures who would embody the spirit of the revolt: Nita Yoshisada and Ashikaga Takauji, both descendants of samurai lineages with their own ambitions. The fate of the shogunate was sealed in 1333. Nita Yoshisada, a commander loyal to the emperor, marched toward Kamakura at the head of an army determined to end Hojo's rule. Chronicles tell that upon reaching the coast, the mountains blocked his path, and the defenses were impenetrable. Then Yoshisada, in an almost mystical gesture, drew his sword and threw it into the sea, imploring the help of the ocean gods. The waters receded, revealing a hidden path among the waves. His troops advanced along the beach and attacked the city from where they were least expected. For days, Kamakura burned. The Hojo resisted in their fortresses, but their fate was sealed. When they realized that defeat was inevitable, more than 700 members of the clan, including women and children, committed mass suicide inside the Toshoji temple. It was the end of a dynasty that had ruled with an iron fist for more than a century. Japan witnessed the collapse of the first shogunate. Go-Daigo returned triumphantly to Kyoto. Freed from exile, he proclaimed the Kenmu Restoration, an attempt to return to the throne the absolute authority it had possessed in ancient times. The emperor abolished the feudal system of Kamakura, returned the confiscated lands to the crown, and sought to establish a centralized government based on Confucian ideals of order and hierarchy. For a brief moment it seemed possible that imperial power might be reborn, but the dream was short-lived. Go-Daigo had underestimated the samurai who had helped him gain power. His idealistic vision of a Japan governed from the temples of Kyoto clashed with the reality of the provincial clans, who expected rewards and autonomy. The imperial administration proved incapable of managing the country, and old resentments resurfaced. The most powerful of his former allies, Ashikaga Takauji, rebelled in 1335. At first, he had been sent by the emperor to suppress a revolt, but instead of obeying, Takauji took control of the troops and seized Kamakura. With the support of numerous eastern clans, he marched on Kyoto and expelled the emperor. It was the repetition of an old story. The samurai once again turned against the throne. Go-Daigo fled south and established a rival court in Yoshino, from where he continued to proclaim himself the legitimate sovereign. For his part, Ashikaga installed an alternative emperor in the capital, the so-called Emperor Komyo, and proclaimed himself the new shogun. Thus began the era of the two courts, a political and symbolic division that split the country into two opposing factions, the northern court, under shogunate control, and the southern court, loyal to Go-Daigo's lineage. The brief imperial rule of Kenmu, born from the illusion of rebirth, ended devoured by the same dynamic that had overthrown the Hojo, the struggle between the ideal and the sword. Japan entered a new stage of its history, marked by the fragmentation of power and the rise of provincial clans. The flames that had consumed Kamakura did not bring peace, but a new cycle of conflicts. Amid the smoke and ruins, the warriors once again decided the fate of the country. And upon the ashes of the old shogunate, another began to rise, more ambitious, more ruthless, and more enduring, the Ashikaga shogunate, also known as Muromachi. The Muromachi shogunate, 1338 to 1573. After the collapse of the Kamakura shogunate and the brief restoration attempt by Emperor Go-Daigo, Japan entered a new stage of its history, an era of fragmented power where warlords and clans ruled each province as small kingdoms. In 1338, Ashikaga Takauji, a former ally of the emperor turned adversary, was officially recognized as shogun. From that moment, power passed into the hands of a new family, the Ashikaga, whose political capital was established in the Muromachi district of Kyoto. The new shogunate arose amid instability. The civil war between the two courts, the northern under the Ashikaga and the southern, loyal to the Go-Daigo lineage, lasted for more than half a century. Battles were sporadic, but the conflict undermined the country's foundations. Each region was governed according to its own interests, and the shogun's authority depended on the volatile loyalty of local clans. Japan had ceased to be a unified nation. It was a constellation of feudal domains orbiting around a weakened central power. Unlike the Hojo regime, the Ashikaga government relied less on administrative rigidity and more on personal alliances. The shoguns acted more as mediators among the clans than as absolute sovereigns. The Muromachi court reflected this ambiguity, a blend of military power and refined culture. While the samurai imposed their authority in the provinces, the arts flourished in Kyoto. No theater, monochrome painting, and the Zen aesthetic that defined the spirituality of medieval Japan. The second shogun, Ashikaga Yoshiakira, consolidated the structures of the new government, but it was his successor, Ashikaga Yoshimitsu, who achieved the period's greatest splendor. He ruled with political skill and a deep sense of balance. During his reign, the war between the two courts came to an end. In 1392, he succeeded in reconciling the southern and northern emperors, symbolically unifying the country under a single imperial line. It was a moment of relative, though fleeting, stability. Under Yoshimitsu, the Muromachi court became a center of power and sophistication comparable to the ancient Heian. The shogun ordered the construction of the splendid Kinkaku-ji, the Golden Pavilion, a temple covered in gold that still symbolizes the harmony between luxury and serenity. He also established diplomatic relations with China's Ming dynasty, opening trade that brought prosperity to Japan and strengthened its position on the Asian stage. However, that harmony concealed a structural fragility. The authority of the shogun depended on his personal charisma and the strength of his clan, but it lacked a central system capable of maintaining order when leadership weakened. After the death of Yoshimitsu, the power of the Ashikaga began to crumble. The regional clans, increasingly autonomous, faced each other for control of land and tributes. The 15th century was marked by growing decentralization. In each province, the daimyo, feudal lords with their own samurai armies, assumed political, military, and judicial functions. Some behaved as independent sovereigns. Local disputes over borders, crops, or inheritances turned into prolonged wars. The balance between the shogun and the daimyo gradually broke, paving the way for a new era of chaos. The situation reached its critical point in 1467 with the Onin War, a long and devastating conflict that began as a succession dispute within the Ashikaga clan itself and spread throughout the country. What initially was a dispute between factions in Kyoto degenerated into a full civil war. Temples burned, neighborhoods were plundered, and the imperial capital became a field of ruins. Samurai families divided between supporters and enemies of the shogunate, and central authority disappeared completely. The Onin War had no clear winner, but it had a definitive outcome: the destruction of Muromachi order. When the conflict ended in 1477, Japan was completely fragmented. The daimyo controlled their domains independently, ignoring the shogun. The former institutions of the bakufu became a shadow of the past. Kyoto, devastated, no longer dictated the course of the country. In this context, a new era was born, the Sengoku Jidai, or period of the warring states. It was a time of continuous wars, betrayals, and rapid ascents, in which power was measured solely by force. Castles replaced temples as symbols of authority, and the sword once again decided the fate of Japan. The Ashikaga shogunate, although weakened, formally survived until 1573, sustained by the inertia of titles and tradition. But its power was illusory. The shogun became prisoners of their own vassals, and the country's politics fell into the hands of military leaders who ruled their provinces as small empires. The country had entered a long night of wars, where each province rose as a world of its own. On the battlefields, amid the roar of drums and the gleam of armor, a new generation of leaders was emerging, dreaming of unifying the archipelago. But before unity, Japan had to go through its most violent and turbulent period, the time of the warlords. The Age of Warring States, Sengoku, circa 1467 to 1590. When the Onin War ended in 1477, Japan had ceased to be a country. It was a mosaic of constantly warring domains. Villages burned, temples were fortified, and local lords raised armies to defend their lands or seize them from their neighbors. Thus began the Sengoku Jidai, the Warring States period, an era in which power was measured only by strength, cunning, and the sword. The central power of the Ashikaga shogunate completely disintegrated. In Kyoto, the shogun still existed, but his authority was purely nominal. The true masters of the country were the daimyo, feudal lords who controlled entire regions and acted as independent sovereigns. Each maintained their own army of samurai, administered justice, minted coins, and imposed tributes. Old feudal loyalties dissolved, replaced by fleeting alliances and inevitable betrayals. War became the way of life in feudal Japan. Fields once covered with rice paddies were transformed into fortresses and camps. Hills were filled with stone and wooden castles, built with military precision to withstand prolonged sieges. From their towers, lords watched the horizon for smoke or enemy banners. The sword, bow, and spear were everyday instruments. The silence between battles was barely a pause before the next betrayal. Among the daimyo arose legendary figures, men who combined brutality with military genius. In the north, the Uesugi clan imposed its authority with monastic discipline. In the west, the Mori extended their maritime dominion, and in the center of the country, the Takeda, under the command of the famous Takeda Shingen, perfected the art of cavalry warfare. Each ruled their territory as their own kingdom, with independent laws, armies, and economies. Alliances were as volatile as the seasons. Marriages between clans were used as political instruments, and betrayals were sealed with blood. The warrior monks of Buddhist temples known as Sohei also took up arms, defending their lands and faith with fanaticism. Even peasants began organizing into armed leagues called Iki that resisted the oppression of the daimyo. It was a fragmented country where each village, each temple, and each castle represented its own world. The military development of the era was remarkable. Combat strategies evolved toward organized warfare, with disciplined formations and the use of banners and signals. Samurai, who once fought in individual duels, learned to coordinate battalions and execute collective maneuvers. War became a science. Martial arts schools proliferated, and the sword ceased to be only a symbol of honor, becoming a tool of dominance. Technological advancement also changed the face of Japanese warfare. In 1543, a Portuguese ship wrecked on the island of Tanegashima, bringing with it a novelty that would forever alter the military balance: the arquebus. The Japanese, ingenious and disciplined, quickly copied the design. Within a few years, firearms spread throughout the country, and the most powerful armies began to integrate them into their tactics. The sound of gunfire replaced the whistle of arrows. Amid the chaos, three figures emerged as the great architects of unification: Oda Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and Tokugawa Ieyasu. Each represented a different stage of the process that would transform feudal Japan into a centralized state. But before their names became prominent, the country went through decades of endless wars where loyalty and betrayal were intertwined in a single gesture. The rise of Oda Nobunaga began in the plains of Owari, a region in the center of the country. With a small but disciplined army, he defeated his rivals through innovative tactics, taking advantage of the mobility and firepower of his troops. In 1560, at the Battle of Okehazama, he managed to defeat the powerful Imagawa Yoshimoto, whose force outnumbered him 10-1. That triumph marked the beginning of a new military order based on strategy and technology. Nobunaga was the first to understand that war had to serve a greater purpose: the unification of Japan. Unlike traditional daimyo, he was not content with dominating his province. His ambition was total and his vision ruthless. He expelled the warrior monks from the fortified temples of Enryakuji, destroyed ancestral clans, and reorganized the economy under a centralized system. Under his command, old feudal structures began to yield to a new form of authority based on absolute power. But unification was far from complete. Nobunaga ruled with an iron hand and tolerated no opposition. In 1582, he was betrayed by one of his generals, Akechi Mitsuhide, and forced to commit suicide at Honnoji Temple. His death left a void that would soon be filled by his brightest successor, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, the man who, born a peasant, would rise to dominate the entire archipelago. Unification under Oda Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and Tokugawa Ieyasu. When the 16th century reached its second half, Japan was a board of perpetual war. For more than 100 years, the daimyo had fought for every valley, every castle, and every grain of rice. But from the ashes of chaos emerged three men who would change the course of the country. They were not just warriors, but strategists, reformers, and visionaries. They did not inherit power, they conquered it. The first was Oda Nobunaga, Lord of Owari. From a young age, he was considered an eccentric, even reckless man. He dressed unusually, spoke arrogantly, and scorned noble etiquette. But behind that chaotic facade hid a brilliant mind. Nobunaga understood that war was not won by force alone, but with discipline, innovation, and psychological terror. His rise began in 1560 at the Battle of Okehazama, when an army of barely 3,000 men crushed the forces of Imagawa Yoshimoto, who outnumbered him 10-1. That victory catapulted him as a military leader. Soon he consolidated his control over central Honshu, and with control of the Kyoto region, he presented himself to the imperial court as the restorer of order. In 1568, he entered the capital with his troops and placed Emperor Ogemachi on the throne, thus initiating the political reunification of the country. Nobunaga was the first to conceive a unified Japan under the power of the modern shogunate. He introduced radical reforms. He eliminated internal tolls to encourage trade, abolished hereditary privileges that hindered the economy, promoted artisanal production, and opened exchange routes with European merchants. He understood the value of firearms brought by the Portuguese and systematically incorporated them into his armies, turning Japan into a modern military power. However, his ambition led him to confront all traditional powers. Nobunaga attacked the fortified Buddhist temples of Enryakuji on Mount Hiei and reduced them to ashes, exterminating thousands of warrior monks. More than a military campaign, it was a symbolic act, the destruction of the ancient religious order that for centuries had dictated Japan's destiny. With each victory, his power grew, but so did his arrogance. His allies feared him as much as his enemies. In 1582, during a stay at the Honnoji Temple, he was betrayed by one of his closest generals, Akechi Mitsuhide. Surrounded and with no escape, Nobunaga immolated himself in the temple flames, choosing to die by his own hand rather than fall prisoner. With his death, the country was once again on the brink of chaos. It was then that an improbable man emerged from among the ranks of his former vassals, Toyotomi Hideyoshi. Born a peasant without a noble surname or lineage, Hideyoshi rose through his intelligence, charisma, and political skill. He earned Nobunaga's favor, and after his death took on the task of continuing his work. Hideyoshi was an unparalleled strategist. In a few years, he eliminated Mitsuhide, pacified the central provinces, and subdued the rebellious clans of the west. In 1585, he was appointed Kampaku, or imperial regent, a title that granted him legal power over the entire country. In 1590, he achieved what no man before him had managed. He unified all of Japan under a single authority. His government was a period of peace and reorganization. He prohibited peasants from carrying weapons, consolidating the samurai's military monopoly. He implemented a national census and a new land division based on rice production, which allowed for accurate calculation of taxes and the military capacity of each domain. His policy was as meticulous as it was relentless. Every samurai knew whom he served, and every peasant knew whom he had to obey. Hideyoshi also looked beyond the sea. In 1592, he launched an ambitious invasion of Korea with the ultimate intention of reaching China. For a time, his army conquered part of Korean territory, but resistance and the intervention of the Ming fleet forced him to retreat. The Korean campaigns consumed resources and lives, and although they demonstrated Japanese military capability, they also revealed the limits of Hideyoshi's personal power. In 1598, gravely ill, Toyotomi Hideyoshi died, leaving behind a unified country but a power in dispute. His son, Toyotomi Hideyori, was still a child, and the leadership vacuum attracted the ambition of the clans. In this scenario emerged the third and last of the great unifiers, Tokugawa Ieyasu, Lord of Mikawa and former ally of both Nobunaga and Hideyoshi. Ieyasu was patient, cold, and calculating. For years he waited for his moment, building alliances and observing his rivals. In 1600, fate was decided at the Battle of Sekigahara, the most decisive confrontation in Japanese history. Two large coalitions faced each other, the Eastern Army, led by Tokugawa, and the Western Army, loyal to the Toyotomi. The dawn of October 21st covered the fields of Sekigahara with a thick fog. Hundreds of thousands of men awaited the beat of the drums. The battle lasted barely 6 hours, but its outcome defined the next 2.5 centuries. At the crucial moment, several Western daimyo switched loyalty, joining Tokugawa's side. The betrayal sealed the victory. With Sekigahara, Japan was finally unified under a single authority. In 1603, Tokugawa Ieyasu was appointed shogun by the emperor, establishing his government in Edo, modern Tokyo. It was the beginning of a new era of peace and stability, the Tokugawa shogunate, which would dominate Japan for more than 250 years. Nobunaga had initiated conquest with force, Hideyoshi consolidated it with organization, and Ieyasu perpetuated it with order. Together, the three completed the work of centuries of war. The country that had known the anarchy of the clans and the fire of burning castles finally found balance. The swords rested, the armor was stored, and for the first time in generations, the sound of war drums was replaced by the murmur of markets and the chants of monks in the temples. Japan had been born from war, but it was about to discover the value of peace. The Tokugawa shogunate, Edo, 1603 to 1868. The Battle of Sekigahara, fought in the autumn of 1600, was not just the end of a war, it was the beginning of a new country. From its smoke and steel-covered fields emerged a man who, patient and calculating, managed to transform feudal chaos into lasting stability. His name was Tokugawa Ieyasu, and his victory marked the start of more than 2.5 centuries of peace. In 1603, the emperor officially recognized him as shogun, thus restoring the old military title, but with a different meaning. He was no longer just the leader of a clan, but the sovereign of an entire nation. His capital was established in Edo, a fortified coastal town chosen for its strategic location between the eastern routes and the sea. Over time, Edo would become one of the most populous and organized cities in the world. The Tokugawa shogunate was one of the most efficient political structures Japan had ever known. Its design combined elements of the traditional feudal system with a carefully centralized bureaucracy. Power rested on 3 pillars: the shogun's military authority, the daimyo's obedience, and the samurai's absolute loyalty. Tokugawa Ieyasu understood that stability did not depend on the strength of arms, but on the balance between control and convenience. That is why he created the system known as Bakuhan Taisei, a dual structure in which the country was divided into domains or han, ruled by the daimyo, but all under the supervision of the Bakufu, the central military government based in Edo. Each feudal lord retained internal autonomy but had to answer directly to the shogun. To ensure the daimyo's loyalty, the Sankin Kotai system, or alternate residence, was imposed. According to this regulation, lords had to live 1 year in Edo and another in their domains, leaving their families in the capital as de facto hostages. This mechanism, subtle as it was, prevented rebellions and encouraged economic development. The constant travel between Edo and the provinces promoted the construction of roads, inns, and services that connected the country like never before. The Tokaido route, linking Edo with Kyoto, became a vital artery. Along its stations moved messengers, merchants, artists, and pilgrims carrying not only goods but also ideas, fashions, and news. Japan, which for centuries had been an archipelago of disconnected fiefs, was beginning to function as a unified organism. Peace brought with it a silent revolution. The fields began to flourish again, the population grew, and the cities expanded. Edo, Osaka, and Kyoto became the nerve centers of the country. In them, an unprecedented urban culture thrived. Crowded markets, kabuki theaters, tea houses, geisha districts, publishing houses, and bookstores printing thousands of volumes each year. For the first time in its history, Japan was experiencing an era of sustained civil prosperity. The social order imposed by the Tokugawa was strict. The population was divided into 4 classes: samurai, peasants, artisans, and merchants, with warriors at the top and merchants at the bottom. In theory, the system guaranteed balance. In practice, it perpetuated hierarchy. The samurai, deprived of the wars that gave meaning to their existence, became officials in the service of the shogunate, in charge of administration and tax collection. Their life was governed by discipline and honor, but also by bureaucracy. The peasants, who represented more than 80% of the population, sustained the economy through rice production, which continued to be the official measure of wealth. Artisans prospered in the cities, and merchants, although officially despised by Confucian morals, accumulated fortunes through credit and trade expansion. Over time, the order silently inverted. Warriors became impoverished, and merchants dominated the economy from the shadows. The shogunate, aware of this threat, imposed a series of sumptuary laws that restricted luxury and ostentatious spending. It was an attempt to preserve social hierarchy in the face of economic reality. Peace had brought wealth, but also inequality. However, Edo's political control remained absolute. Every daimyo had to report, every samurai obey, and every citizen knew their place. One of the pillars of the regime was foreign policy. After the unification wars and brief trade relations with the Portuguese and Spanish, the Tokugawa decided to close the country to the world. In 1639, the National Isolation Policy, or Sakoku, was enacted. Under this measure, no Japanese could leave the country, and no foreigner could enter without the shogun's permission. Only a small group of Dutch merchants was allowed to operate in the artificial port of Dejima in Nagasaki under strict supervision. However, isolation did not mean stagnation. Japan developed a strong internal economy with an efficient trade network and precisely controlled agricultural production. Arts and sciences flourished in their own forms. Ceramics, lacquer, no theatre, popular literature, and ukiyo-e prints reflected a society that found beauty in the ephemeral. Zen philosophy and the wabi-sabi aesthetic, that is, simplicity and imperfection as a form of perfection, permeated daily life. Edo became an orderly and monumental city. Its population, which surpassed 1 million in the 18th century, made it one of the largest cities on the planet. The streets were carefully planned, the canals served for transport and cleaning, and security was remarkable. Even in the humblest neighborhoods, crime was minimal. At a time when Europe was torn apart by religious wars, Japan lived in a rigid, vigilant, and stable silence. Nevertheless, beneath that calm, cracks began to form. The samurai, increasingly in debt, depended on the money of merchants whom they despised. The state, supported by an agrarian economy, could not adapt to the dynamism of the urban market. Famines, tax increases, and administrative corruption generated unrest among peasants and commoners. Rural uprisings and urban riots, though contained, revealed that Tokugawa peace was more fragile than it appeared. Despite this, the system endured. Social discipline, censorship, and information control prevented any real threat to the shogun's power. For more than 2 centuries, Japan remained closed to the outside world, developing an introspective, refined, and deeply ordered civilization. It was a nation that had made isolation its strength, but time and history do not stop. While Japan looked inward, the rest of the world was changing with the Industrial Revolution. European powers expanded their fleets and sought new markets in Asia. On the Pacific coasts, steam warships began charting routes eastward. No wall, however high, could contain that tide. When Commodore Matthew Perry's ships appeared off Edo in 1853, the shogunate discovered that its peace was doomed. Western cannons did not just demand the opening of ports, they demanded the end of a world. In less than 2 decades, the structure that had held the country together for 250 years would collapse under the force of modernity. The Tokugawa shogunate was more than a political regime. It was an experiment of near-perfect balance between order and repression, between discipline and beauty, between tradition and survival. During its long reign, Japan remained intact, preserving its identity while the rest of the world transformed. When it finally opened, it did so not from weakness, but from a solid self-awareness. Economy, domestic trade, and feudal monetization. During the Tokugawa shogunate, Japan reached a unique economic balance, sustained by internal peace and meticulous administration. With no wars devastating the fields nor foreign invasions interrupting trade, the country was able to focus on internal development. For the first time, the Japanese economy was structured around production, transportation, and currency, generating a national network of exchange that connected rural villages with large cities. The foundation of the economic system was rice, considered the fundamental unit of wealth. Each feudal domain measured its power not by territorial size, but by its annual rice production, calculated in koku, a unit equivalent to one person's annual consumption. Taxes were collected in rice and stored in the daimyo's granaries, which were then converted into money or used to feed their samurai. Thus, rice was simultaneously food, tribute, and symbolic currency. The agricultural surplus generated a new phenomenon, the emergence of rural markets and the expansion of internal trade. Across the country, routes were established connecting the producing regions with major urban centers, especially Edo, Osaka, and Kyoto. An organized road system emerged with post stations and inns, allowing the movement of goods, messengers, and travelers. Among them, the Tokaido route, which linked Edo with Kyoto, became the vital axis of the economy and the symbol of the new prosperity. Trade also promoted feudal monetization. Although rice remained the official measure of value, the circulation of gold, silver, and copper coins became common. The shogunate controlled minting, but regional fluctuations and metal shortages generated a complex economy, where exchange rates varied according to location and social class. Merchants, theoretically the lowest class in the system, became the true engines of wealth. Their skill in managing credit, loans, and alliances with the daimyo allowed them to accumulate fortunes that in many cases surpassed those of the samurai. Castle towns, founded as administrative centers, transformed into commercial and cultural hubs. Edo, Osaka, and Sakai flourished as centers of exchange, giving rise to a dynamic urban culture. Markets offered silk, tea, ceramics, paper, weapons, and textiles, while the streets filled with theaters, workshops, and taverns. The constant flow of goods created a consumer economy unprecedented in Japanese history. However, this growth had imbalances. Samurai, who relied on a fixed salary in rice, began to go into debt to increasingly powerful merchants. The old feudal order was quietly reversing. The warriors maintained prestige, but the merchants controlled the money. The shogunate, aware of the danger, enacted laws to restrict luxury and limit ostentation, attempting to preserve social hierarchy in the face of economic advancement. Edo Japan lived in a constant contradiction. It was a feudal country with a capitalist soul. Isolated from the world, it had created a complex economic system capable of sustaining millions of people with almost mathematical precision. But beneath the surface of that harmony, real power began to move, no longer in the rice fields or the shogun's courts, but in the workshops, ports, and markets where money dictated the new rules. The samurai culture, bushidō, martial arts, and philosophy. Although Edo Japan lived in peace, its spirit remained forged in the discipline of the warrior. The samurai, who for centuries had ruled by the sword, found in the stability of the Tokugawa shogunate a new purpose: to preserve the country's morality, honor, and identity. They were no longer campaign soldiers, but guardians of a code that transcended war. That code was known as bushidō, the way of the warrior. Bushido was not a written law, but a moral synthesis. At its roots coexisted Confucianism, which taught loyalty to one's superior, Shinto, which exalted purity and respect for ancestors, and Zen Buddhism, which taught detachment and serenity in the face of death. From this fusion arose a rigorous ethic where courage, honesty, modesty, and discipline formed a single virtue: self-mastery. In times of peace, Bushido acquired an almost spiritual character. The samurai had to live with the same dignity with which he was expected to die. His daily life was marked by temperance, sobriety in dress, precision in speech, and absolute respect for his lord and family were expected. Disobedience, even for noble reasons, was a stain that could only be cleansed by death. The ideal of seppuku, or ritual self-inflicted death, became the ultimate expression of Bushido. Far from being a desperate act, it represented the final proof of honor. Opening one's belly with the short sword, the wakizashi, demonstrated that body and spirit remained incorrupt. Contemporary texts describe it solemnly as a gesture of purity that restored the universe's harmony. The practice of martial arts continued to be the core of samurai training, even though war had disappeared. Schools of kenjutsu, that is, swordsmanship, kyujutsu, or archery, naginata jutsu, or halberd use, and jujutsu, unarmed combat techniques, flourished throughout the country. Dojos became places for teaching both body and spirit. Combat was no longer conceived as destroying the enemy, but as surpassing one's own ego. Zen, especially, left a profound mark on the samurai mindset. Meditation, silence, and the pursuit of inner emptiness were understood as preparation for combat. A warrior who mastered his mind was invincible because he did not fear death. The sword, in this context, was more than a weapon. It was the instrument that united life and death in a single moment of awareness. During the Edo period, many samurai also cultivated literature, calligraphy, painting, and haiku poetry. They understood that perfection was not achieved solely through physical skill, but in the harmony between action and contemplation. Thus, the warrior and the monk merged into a single ideal: to live with purpose, to die with dignity. Bushido, more than a military code, was a way of existence. In a country where the sword slept, honor remained awake. And although time would transform samurai into officials and bureaucrats, their legacy, composed of the idea that inner discipline is worth more than external victory, became the invisible soul of modern Japan. Religion, spirituality, and Japanese syncretism. In the history of Japan, religion was never an imposition, but a way of coexistence. Far from absolute dogmas, the Japanese built a spirituality based on harmony among different forces. For centuries, the country did not choose between one faith and another. It fused them all into a single vision of the world. From that fusion was born the Japanese religious spirit, where the divine was not sought in the heavens, but in nature, in ancestors, and in everyday actions. The foundation of that spirituality was Shinto, the native religion of the archipelago. Its essence does not reside in a sacred book or doctrine, but in respect for the kami, spirits that inhabit all things: mountains, rivers, trees, storms, animals, and even man-made objects. The kami are not gods in the Western sense, but sacred presences that express life itself. Shinto teaches that humans are part of a natural cycle that must be kept pure and balanced. Purity, or harai, became one of the central values. Washing hands before entering a shrine is not a symbolic gesture, but a way to cleanse the spirit. With the arrival of Buddhism from China and Korea in the 6th century, Japan adopted a more philosophical and transcendental view of existence. In its early forms, known as Tendai and Shingon, Buddhism adapted to Shinto, building temples alongside shrines and sharing ceremonies. For the Japanese, both beliefs did not contradict each other. While Shinto explained life, Buddhism taught how to accept death. During the Kamakura period and the following centuries, Zen Buddhism consolidated as the most influential current among samurais and the intellectual elite. Its emphasis on meditation, or zazen, simplicity, and direct understanding of the present fit the warrior's mindset. The silence of the temple and the concentration of the swordsman were expressions of the same pursuit, achieving inner clarity. Zen shaped not only religion but also art, architecture, and even the social etiquette of feudal Japan. Syncretism reached its peak in the idea that Shinto kami were local manifestations of Buddhas. For centuries, that fusion remained without conflict. In the same sacred space, a Shinto altar and the image of Buddha could coexist. Temples became centers of political, educational, and economic power. Monks participated in local administration, guarded libraries, and in times of war even formed armies. However, the arrival of Christianity in the 16th century introduced a new tension. Although some daimyo adopted it, the Tokugawa shogunate considered it a threat to social order. The persecution of Christians from 1614 marked the return to traditional balance. Religious isolation was as firm as political. Japan decided to keep its faith in itself. Thus, Edo period Japan lived under a dual and complementary spirituality. Shinto celebrated life, Buddhism impermanence. Together, both views taught people to accept the ephemeral beauty of the world and to find in each moment a reflection of the divine. End of the feudal period. Arrival of the Westerners and the fall of the shogunate. Inhabiting its religious complexity, its honorable culture, and its political contradictions, Japan had remained isolated from the rest of the world for more than 2 centuries. The coasts were watched, the ports closed, and contact with foreigners limited to a small Dutch enclave in Nagasaki. Within its borders, the Tokugawa order seemed immutable, the social hierarchy remained rigid, the economy was self-sufficient, and peace seemed eternal. But by the mid-19th century, the world knocked on the archipelago's doors with the force of modernity. In July 1853, 4 American warships, the so-called Black Ships, appeared off Edo Bay. In command was Commodore Matthew Perry, sent by the President of the United States with a clear mission: to demand Japan's commercial opening. Its cannons, shining under the coal smoke, symbolized the industrial power of the West. It was a spectacle no samurai could ignore. Perry delivered a letter requesting diplomatic treaties and promised to return with a larger fleet if he received no response. The shogunate, aware of its technological inferiority, had no alternative. In 1854, the Treaty of Kanagawa was signed, opening 2 ports to foreign trade. Soon after, similar agreements were signed with other European powers. What had been unthinkable for centuries became inevitable. Japan was opening to the world. But this opening was also a deep wound to its national pride. The arrival of the Westerners exposed the internal weaknesses of the Tokugawa regime. The daimyo and samurai began to split between those who accepted modernization and those who demanded the expulsion of the barbarians. A political and spiritual movement known as Sono-joi emerged, swearing to revere the emperor, expel foreigners, and seeking to restore imperial power and end the shogunate, with the idea of recovering the traditional and honorable Japan forged by the sword of the samurai. In this way, the country entered a political crisis. The shogun's authority, already worn, was crumbling. Rising taxes, famines, and inflation fueled popular discontent. Foreign weapons and ideas of freedom circulated through the ports, and in the shadows, southern clans like Satsuma and Choshu began organizing to overthrow the regime. In 1868, tensions reached their peak with the Boshin War, a brief but decisive civil war between the shogunate forces and supporters of Emperor Meiji. The traditional armies, still equipped with swords and armor, faced troops already using rifles and modern cannons. The technological difference sealed the fate of the Tokugawa. Imperial victory marked the beginning of the Meiji Restoration, which abolished feudalism, dissolved the daimyo domains, and proclaimed the modernization of the state. The shogunate, which had maintained peace through control for centuries, disappeared without return. In its place, a new Japan was born, determined to learn from the West in order not to be dominated by it. The end of the Edo period was not an abrupt fall, but a transformation. The country of silence and the sword became an industrial and modern nation, yet deep in its identity beneath the trains, factories, and uniforms, the echo of bushidō still beat, the ancient voice of the samurai that had forged the soul of Japan.